1 week after our divorce. My ex-marriage. His perfect dream woman. But when I saw her face, I couldn't help but laugh. Welcome to her revenge. Today, I've got a new story you wouldn't want to miss. Just a week after our divorce, my ex-husband immediately brought home his flawless dream wife. A prestigious eyes with perfect looks. He made cruel remarks, telling me I was nothing more than an outdated antique just because of a scar on my neck. But when I saw her real face in the original printout at the newspaper office, I couldn't help but laugh because his goddess carried a secret that could never be erased. And he had no idea I was the one who held the key that could bring everything down in an instant. The fact that you're here means everything to me. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me where in the world are you watching from, your city, your country. I want to know. A small note. This story weaves in fictional elements for entertainment and perspective. Any resemblance to names or places is coincidental. But the lessons woven through it, those are worth keeping. I still remember exactly how the apartment smelled that evening. Gardenias from the florist on Columbus Avenue and the faint ghost of Julian's cologne that never quite left the air even when he wasn't home. I had left Luminary at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, which for the week before our February issue went to press was practically a federal crime. My editor-in-chief gave me a look when I said I was heading out early. The kind of look that doesn't need words. I gave her one back that said, "It's Valentine's Day and I'm making duck." She let me go. I stopped at Whole Foods on Broadway first. Buying the ingredients felt important, like an act of good faith. 2 duck breasts, fresh cherries for the reduction fingerling potatoes, a bottle of Côte d'Ivoire, and a bunch of red and white tulips from the display near the door. The woman ahead of me in line had 2 kids hanging off her cart and a tired smile. And I thought, at least someone else is trying. The penthouse on West 75th looked the way it always did. Beautiful, expensive, and somehow not quite mine. Julian had chosen everything in it. The clean-lined furniture in shades of cream and dark walnut. The framed black and white photography prints from a Soho gallery he'd visited without me. The row of perfectly pressed suits visible through the open closet door like a department store display. His cedar and citrus cologne lived in the curtains, in the couch cushions, in the air itself. Even when Julian wasn't home, Julian was present. I put on an apron and started cooking. I want to be honest. I am not a good cook. But I had spent the past week watching tutorials on seared duck breast, taking notes on a yellow legal pad like there was going to be a test. I practiced the cherry reduction twice before today. I learned you score the fat side of the duck before it hits the pan. That the pan needs to be properly hot first. That patience is the difference between a good result and a great one. I was determined to get this right. By 5:30, the apartment smelled like something a restaurant charges $60 a plate for. I set the table by the window, ivory tablecloth. 2 white pillar candles in crystal holders. The good wine glasses we'd gotten as a wedding gift and used maybe 3 times. Tulips in a low vase between the candles. I stepped back, looked at it, and thought, he's going to love this. Then I went to get dressed. I chose a navy dress with a high collar. Not because I particularly liked the neckline, but because I had gotten into the habit of choosing necklines that covered the left side of my throat. 8 months earlier, I'd had surgery to remove a small thyroid tumor stage. 1 clean margins completely successful. My surgeon had said, and I had held on to those words like a life raft. The procedure left a thin scar barely an inch long just above my collarbone. Most people didn't notice it. Julian noticed it every single time. He never said anything about it directly. He didn't have to. I had learned to read the way his eyes moved when he looked at me now. And I had learned quietly to dress accordingly. I went to check the potatoes and didn't think about it anymore. At 7:00, my phone lit up on the counter. Running behind. Big account meeting. Don't wait on me. I read the message twice. Then I set the phone face down and lit the candles. At 8, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat down alone at the table I had set for 2. The duck was in the oven on low. The candles threw warm light across the ivory cloth and the empty chair across from me. Outside Manhattan carried on the way it always does. Indifferent to Valentines. Indifferent to tulips. indifferent to a woman in a high-collared dress who had practiced cherry reduction twice and was now drinking Côte d'Ivoire by herself. At 9:30, I tried calling. For Ring's voicemail. I stood at the kitchen counter for a moment afterward, not doing anything in particular. Then I walked to the bookshelf where our wedding photo sat in a silver-framed Julian in a grey suit, hair perfectly in place, smiling at the camera with that easy, unhurried confidence that had first caught my attention at a media industry dinner 3 years before we married. He had looked like a man who knew exactly where he was supposed to be. I had thought, I want to know someone like that. For a long time. I thought I did. At 10:30, a key turned in the lock. Julian came in looking exactly the way Julian always looked. Composed. Impeccable. Not a crease. Out of place. But something was different tonight. The scent that came in with him was warmer than usual. Sweeter. Wholly unfamiliar. Not the cedar and citrus that lived in our curtains. Something that hadn't come from our bathroom shelf. He stopped just inside the door and looked at the room. At the candles. At the tulips. At the table. At me. Standing there with a dish towel still folded over one arm. His expression was completely unreadable. Not surprised. Not moved. Not sorry. Just still. He set his leather bag on the armchair. Shrugged off his coat. Said nothing. Then he reached into the bag, unzipped an interior pocket, and pulled out a thick stack of papers. He walked to the table, and placed them down right beside the dinner plate I had never touched. He straightened up and looked at me. I looked down at the papers on the table, and all I could think was, he hadn't even taken off his watch, as if he wasn't planning to stay. I picked up the papers. My hands didn't shake. Not right away. The first page was clinical in the way legal documents always are, all stated fact and no wasted sentiment. At the top in clean typeface, complaint for divorce. Below it 2 names. Mine then Julian's, the same pairing that had appeared on our wedding invitations. Our lease agreement. Our joint checking account reduced now to a header on a document his attorney had drawn up while I was at Whole Foods picking out tulips. I read it once. Set it down with the same care I'd use on something fragile. Then I looked up. Julian stood precisely where he had been a few feet back from the table, shoulders squared, both hands settled into the pockets of his trousers. He wasn't fidgeting. Wasn't bracing. He had the particular stillness of a man who had already made peace with what was coming and was simply waiting for it to be finished. What is this? I said. You can read. He said. I kept both hands flat on the table. Why? It wasn't a question. He understood the difference. What happened next is something I have replayed many times since, looking for the moment I should have seen it coming. Julian's eyes moved not to my face, but slightly downward, to the left side of my neck, just above the collar I had chosen specifically, so he wouldn't have to look at what was underneath. I watched him look at it the way you watch someone examine a defect in a piece of merchandise they're deciding whether to return. When he finally spoke, his voice had that measured, almost gentle quality he uses when delivering bad news in professional settings. Careful and quiet, like he's doing you a favor by being so composed. That scar, he said, is a blemish in my perfect life. I didn't move. I can't be with someone who's broken. He said the word the way you might say overdue or discontinued, a matter of categorization, not a judgment. And somehow the neutrality of it was worse than if he'd shouted. You restore antique pieces. You know how this works. You take something damaged. You do what you can with it. And then you put it in storage because a broken piece doesn't belong on display. And it certainly doesn't belong beside someone like me. 3 years. He had spent 3 years watching me spend weekends at estate sales and flea markets. Listening to me talk about mid-century furniture like the objects had feelings worth considering. Watching me come home dusty and satisfied from an afternoon in someone's garage. And he had taken all of that quietly, assembled it, and turned it into the most precise weapon he had available. I let the silence sit for exactly 3 seconds. I had cancer. Julian. My voice came out steady. That surprised me. The surgery saved my life. I know that. He met my eyes for the first time since he'd walked through the door. And I mean it when I say I'm grateful you're here. But what I need in a partner is someone who reflects the image I've spent years building. That's not a small thing. It's the foundation of everything I do. And you don't reflect it anymore. The version of you that worked for this life, that's not who's standing in front of me. So you'd like to replace me? He didn't answer directly. He took a breath instead. There's someone, he said, who understands what this life actually requires. The candle behind me guttered once, then studied. Her name is Genevieve Whitmore. He said it without inflection, the way you'd read a line off a briefing document. Her family runs the Grand Hotel Group. It's a major hospitality chain. Properties in 6 cities. She moves in the right circles. She understands the role. Genevieve Whitmore. I had never heard the name before that night. I filed it away without showing that I had the role. I said, "That's right. You mean the role of your wife?" Julian said nothing, which was of course its own kind of answer. I watched him cross to the armchair where he'd left his coat, pick it up and put it back on with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to hotel lobbies and airport drop-offs, places where you collect your things and move on to the next thing without looking back. Every gesture was composed. He didn't rush and he didn't linger and he never once looked uncertain. "I'll be at the hotel tonight," he said already at the door. "I'll arrange to collect the rest of my things sometime next week. My attorney has already reviewed the petition. It's as straightforward as it can be at this stage." "At this stage," I repeated. He opened the door. "Good night, Serafina." The door closed. The latch clicked into place with a sound that was very small for something so final. I stood in the dining room for a moment, just standing in the particular shock of a silence that arrives after a very loud thing. Even when no one was shouting. The candles were still going. The duck had been sitting in a low oven for 3 hours. The tulips in the vase were exactly where I'd put them. I walked to the bedroom window and watched his car pull away from the curb below. Black sedan unhurried, gone within half a block into the stream of midtown traffic as if the city had simply absorbed him. Then I went to the bathroom. The light above the mirror is brutally honest. I pulled the collar of my dress down just enough to see what I had been covering all evening. The scar was what it had always been. Thin. Pale pink. Less than an inch. A clean curve above my left collarbone. My surgeon had called it minimal. I had spent 8 months building a quiet wardrobe of high necklines around it. Not because it bothered me, but because I had learned by careful degrees to accommodate the way Julian looked at it. I stood in that light and looked at the scar the way Julian had just looked at it once. Deliberately. So I would know exactly what that felt like. And so I would never confuse it with how I looked at it myself. Then I let the collar go. Turned off the light. And decided, in the flat certain way you decide something when you have finally run out of reasons not to, that I would not do that again. I stood at the window and watched his car disappear into the city below. What I didn't know then was that the night he walked out, he had already taken something far more important than his suitcase. Morning came the way it always does. Indifferent grey and too bright for the kind of night I'd just survived. The first thing I registered before I even opened my eyes was that my neck hurt. The second was the smell a candle burned down to nothing sometime during the night, and beneath it the faint cloying sweetness of food that had been left out too long. I had fallen asleep on the couch in my dress. The dining room was exactly as Julian had left it. Papers on the table. 2 unused wine glasses. Tulips that had not yet figured out what kind of evening they'd been purchased for. I started with the food. Threw out the duck. Scraped the potatoes into the trash. Rinsed the dishes under water that ran too hot. The way the taps always did in that apartment. Burned my fingers slightly. Adjusted the handle. Kept going. I washed each plate with more care than was strictly required. It's the kind of cleaning you do when you need your hands occupied so your mind doesn't have to be. The tulips I bagged up last. They were still mostly fresh. That bothered me more than it should have. Then, without planning to look, without meaning to, I found the gaps. The closet shelf on the left side of the bedroom where Julian kept his folded cashmere sweaters and weekend clothes. The things that didn't need pressing, empty. Not hastily cleared. Empty the way a shelf looks after years of holding something and then abruptly not. The impression of the objects was still there somehow. The way furniture leaves marks on carpet. In the bathroom, his shaving kit was gone from the cabinet below the sink. The corner of the vanity where he kept his cufflink case had a clean rectangular absence in the dust. He had packed before Valentine's Day, before the papers, before the dinner I had practiced for a week. There was no message from him. Not from the previous night. Not from the hours I'd slept. Nothing at all. I stood at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee. I wasn't yet drinking and let myself think for the first time without interruption about what I had refused to name while he was still standing in the room. The signs had been there for months. Julian coming home later and later, not occasionally. Not once or twice. But steadily. Incrementally. The way a tide retreats without ever announcing itself. His phone face down on every flat surface in this apartment since at least October. The counter. The nightstand. The coffee table. I had catalogued each instance without labeling it. Filed it away under a category I hadn't created yet. And the cologne. That warm, unfamiliar one he'd worn last night. I had actually registered a trace of it once before, weeks earlier, when he'd come home from what he'd described as a client dinner in Midtown. I'd taken note of it. I'd done nothing with it. I am an editor. I construct narratives for a living. Find the shape in raw material. Decide what belongs in the frame. And what gets cut. And the story I had been writing about my own marriage, it turned out, was the one story I wasn't willing to revise. I had a structure already decided, a resolution I was committed to. And I had been quietly editing around every piece of evidence that didn't support it. The surgery gave me reasonable cover. 8 months of looking inward. Of having a legitimate reason to focus on healing rather than asking uncomfortable questions. It had made avoidance feel almost virtuous. I told myself Julian was under pressure. I told myself the distance was temporary. I told myself we were still finding our way back to each other. It's remarkable what a well-constructed story can conceal even from the person writing it. I finished the coffee, changed out of the navy dress, and called Rachel Hole. Rachel was an attorney I'd worked with on Lumina's contract side contributor agreements, licensing questions, the occasional dispute over editorial rights. She was methodical, plain-spoken, and had no patience for beating around the bush, which were 3 qualities I needed badly that morning. I reached her on the second ring. "Tell me what happened," she said. And so I did, briefly, in order, without editorializing the papers on the table. What Julian had said. The fact that his attorney had apparently already reviewed the petition. Rachel listened without interrupting. "Bring whatever financial documents you can access," she said when I finished. "Joint accounts. Any shared property. Anything with both names on it. Don't make any transfers before we meet. We need a clear picture of what's there before anyone touches anything." "Understood," I said. 9:00 a.m. Tomorrow. My office on Lex. I wrote the appointment in my planner and then went to work. Luminary on a closing week has a particular kind of energy-controlled urgency. Everyone slightly over-caffeinated. The air in the open bullpen carrying the familiar smell of printer toner and ambition. Nobody looked at me differently when I walked in. Nobody asked. I sat down at my desk, opened the February issue page proofs, and started working through the galleys with a red pen. For the next 4 hours, I was simply a senior editor marking corrections, which was something I understood entirely how to do and required nothing from me that I didn't have left. The editorial assistant left a sandwich on my desk around noon. I ate most of it without tasting it. The work didn't fix anything, but it gave the day a structure. And structure was something solid to stand on when everything beneath it had already shifted. I stayed until 7:30. Took the 1 train home, cold platform. The familiar shudder of the express blowing through on the parallel track. And walked the 4 blocks to the building, with my coat pulled close against a February wind that had picked up since morning. Upstairs. The apartment was quiet and orderly. The empty shelf in the bedroom closet was visible from the front hall, with the overhead light on a rectangular absence in a space that had always held something. I sat down at the kitchen table and opened my banking app. Our joint account. The one we'd opened together in 2019 with the idea that we were saving towards something real. Something that would finally be ours. The screen loaded. The balance appeared. I stared at it. Read each digit slowly left to right. Then I sat very still for a long time because sometimes the body understands a betrayal before the mind is willing to. Rachel's office smelled of cedar and old paper. The kind of room that had witnessed its share of dismantled lives. And made no effort to pretend otherwise. It was on the 32nd floor of a building on Lexington Avenue with a view of Midtown that on a clear day was probably impressive and on a grey February morning simply looked like the city going about its business without any awareness of why you were there. I had brought what Rachel asked for 3 months of printed bank statements, the mortgage agreement that only had Julian's name on it, and the title to the joint account we'd opened together after our wedding. Rachel sat across from me and read without speaking. I appreciated that about her. She didn't narrate her reaction as it happened, didn't fill silence with commentary. She just read. I watched the small line between her eyebrows deepen slightly as she moved through the pages and said nothing until she was done. "All right," she said, and set the papers down with the particular deliberateness of someone arranging their thoughts before speaking. "Walk me through what you knew about this account." We both contributed every month. I said it was supposed to be a down payment fund. We'd been building it for 3 years. And you weren't monitoring the individual transactions. The balance had always looked roughly right. I checked it maybe twice a year. Rachel nodded in the way that means that's exactly what he was counting on. She pulled the statements toward her again and ran one finger down a column of figures. 8 entries spread across 6 months. Each one a number that looked like a business transaction and nothing else. These transfers started in August of last year. She said, August 2021. The month I had spent 4 days in a hospital bed and then 3 weeks in the apartment. Moving carefully between the bedroom and the couch. Taking my temperature twice a day and not lifting anything heavier than a book. Julian had visited every afternoon during the hospital stay. Punctual. Composed. Bringing the things I'd asked for and the things I hadn't thought to ask for. He had been by any external measure attentive. But I remembered thinking once during one of those visits, that he looked like a man who was precisely where he was supposed to be rather than a man who wanted to be there. I had thought that and then I had let it go. And now I was sitting in a lawyer's office reading bank statements that told me what he had actually been doing that August while I was monitoring my own drain output and trying to keep crackers down. The story I had been telling myself had finally run out of pages. The recipient, Rachel continued, is listed as Genevieve Ellis Whitmore, LLC. Registered in Delaware, operating address in Manhattan. The memo line on every single transfer reads, Creative Consulting and Brand Development. She looked up. He used your joint marital account to fund his girlfriend's business while you were recovering from cancer surgery. There wasn't much to say to that. So I didn't say anything. What we're looking at, Rachel said, leaning back slightly, is what New York courts call dissipation of marital assets. When one spouse unilaterally transfers money from shared funds for purposes that benefit only themselves, especially when those purposes involve an extramarital relationship, a judge in an equitable distribution proceeding has the authority to hold them accountable for it. In plain terms, the court can order Julian to compensate you for what he moved. The fact that every one of these transfers happened while you were hospitalized is going to matter. Can we actually recover it? Not all of it and not immediately. But we build the argument. We document the timeline. And we make sure the judge understands exactly what was happening and when. She picked up her pen. I'd like to file an emergency motion to freeze any remaining joint assets, and I want you to stay out of the account entirely until we have a court date confirmed. I said that was fine. She wrote something down on the walk back to the subway. I didn't think about any of it. I thought about nothing in particular. Which is sometimes the mind's way of processing something it isn't quite ready to face directly. That evening, back in the apartment that was no longer quite ours and not yet simply mine, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and typed a name into the search bar for the first time. Genevieve Whitmore. The results populated immediately. Hundreds of them. Then thousands. Society pages. Event coverage. Profile pieces in the kind of glossy publications that specialize in people who have always had enough money to be interesting. She was photographed at a Met fundraiser in a rose gold gown. At a waterfront charity dinner in the Hamptons. At what appeared to be a private gallery opening in Chelsea, holding a champagne flute and laughing at something just off frame. She was described consistently and apparently without irony as a vision of modern elegance. A leading figure in philanthropic circles. An eyes to the Grand Hotel Group with properties in 6 American cities. I scrolled. Her face was striking in the way that makes a photo editor's eye pause. Not because there was something wrong with it, but because there was something almost precisely right about it that the professional part of my brain couldn't fully accept at face value. The geometry was flawless in a way that felt architectural rather than natural. I couldn't have named what specifically put me on edge. It was the kind of thing, you know, from years of working with images before and after they've been processed. I kept scrolling. Near the bottom of the second page of results, I found an older photograph charity auction 4 or 5 years back. Lower resolution. The kind of image taken before everyone had a professional photographer at every event. Genevieve was laughing at something. Her head tilted very slightly downward as she smiled. It was a specific particular gesture, and something about it snagged in me the way a half-remembered word will catch somewhere in the back of the throat. I had seen that before. Not the face. The gesture. The small particular angle of it. I couldn't place it. I tried for a few minutes and then stopped trying because the harder I looked, the more it seemed to slip. I closed the laptop. The name Genevieve Whitmore sat somewhere in my chest like a splinter. I couldn't quite locate. And somewhere in the back of my editor's mind, something about her face refused to let me go. New York has a particular cruelty. The city doesn't slow down for your heartbreak. It just puts the source of it on every screen you pass. The 2.5 weeks between Valentine's Day and the close of February went by in the way time does when you're running on instinct. One obligation to the next. One deadline clearing to reveal another behind it. Julian came back for the last of his things on a Saturday morning while I was at Luminary going over page layouts. He left his key on the kitchen counter and took nothing he didn't want. When I came home that evening and found the key sitting there, I put it on the windowsill and made dinner and did not think about what it meant with any particular depth, because depth was a luxury I wasn't affording myself that month. The morning of March 4th started. Typically, I was running the weekly editorial meeting. 8 people around the conference table. The February recap on the whiteboard. The March calendar taking shape when Darren, my editorial assistant, came in quietly and set a folded section of a trade publication down at the edge of my workspace. Darren had been with me for 2 years and had developed a finely calibrated sense of when information needed to be delivered and when it needed to wait. The fact that he brought it in during the meeting rather than after told me something. The fact that he folded it told me a little more. I finished the point I was making about the March cover copy. Then I looked down. The photograph occupied most of the page. Julian and Genevieve Whitmore photographed at a charity gala the previous evening at the plaza. Event lighting doing what event lighting does. Smoothing everything. Gilding. Everyone making the occasion look consecrated by wealth. Julian stood in a charcoal suit with his shoulders at the exact angle he always used when he knew a camera was present. Genevieve wore ivory off the shoulder. One hand resting on his arm with the relaxed possessiveness of someone who has never once been uncertain about what belongs to them. The caption described her as the Whitmore Aries and named Julian as Aura Butte's newest strategic partner. I set the paper aside and looked up. Page 11. I said. The Harper retrospective. Do we have the photographer's final selects yet, or are we still waiting? We were still waiting. We spent another 40 minutes going through the rest of the agenda. I flagged 2 subheadings that weren't pulling their weight, questioned a layout decision that buried the strongest visual, and assigned 3 pieces to the March editorial calendar. I did all of it without, as far as I could determine, giving anyone in that room a single reason to ask if I was all right. I considered this the first genuinely useful thing I had accomplished since the 14th. After the meeting, I stood at the conference room window for a moment 19 floors above the street, looking at nothing in particular. Then I went back to my desk. Rachel forwarded the legal correspondence that afternoon with a note in plain language. Julian's attorney had sent a formal letter requesting that I vacate the penthouse apartment at 422 West 75th Street by the end of March. I called her immediately. His name is not on the lease, she said. She had a way of stating legal facts that made the opposing argument sound not just incorrect, but vaguely embarrassing. Your name is the building's management is bound by your lease agreement and not by anything. Julian Mercer's attorney chooses to put on letterhead. You have no obligation to accommodate his timeline. I'd like to stay then. Stay as long as the lease runs. Let them write letters. A pause. Get an extra key made just in case. I thanked her, hung up, and made a note to stop at the hardware store on Broadway. That evening, I ate standing at the kitchen counter with a book open beside me that I managed roughly 30 pages of before I gave up and closed it. I made tea. I let it go cold. Then I did what I had been avoiding doing since the night I'd closed the laptop on Genevieve Whitmore's face. I picked up my phone and opened Instagram. Her account was public. 11 million followers. Nothing hidden. The most recent post had gone up 2 hours earlier. A photograph of the city at dusk from a high corner window that I recognized as the Plaza's. Anyone who has done event coverage in that building knows the particular angle of those northeast-facing suites. The way the skyline stacks behind the park in the fading light. There were no people in the frame. Just the view. And in the lower left corner of the image resting on the marble window ledge, a champagne flute and the edge of a watch. The caption read, "A city that never settles for less." Julian was not tagged. He didn't need to be. I had been living alongside that watch for 3 years. A PC Philippe Nautilus steel case. Blue textured dial. The kind of piece that announces itself without announcing itself to anyone who knows what they are looking at. I knew its proportions the way you know a recurring word in a manuscript. There was no question. I closed the app. Sat back. Opened it again. And then set the phone face down on the coffee table and decided I needed to stop doing that. At 11:00, it buzzed with a notification. A direct message from an account I had never encountered. The profile photo was a small square of abstract oil paint. Amber lead over grey. With what looked like a raw umber ground. The kind of image a working studio artist uses when they want to be identifiable as an actual human being without making themselves searchable. The account showed 47 followers, 11 posts, all paintings or sketchbooks or photographs of a work. The most recent had been uploaded 6 days prior. Everything about it read as a real person who simply wasn't trying very hard to be known. The account name was P. Beaumorn. The message read, "I saw the photo of Julian Mercer and Genevieve Whitmore tonight. I know who that woman really is. And I think you deserve to know, too. Are you Sarafina Calloway?" I read it 3 times, with the particular attention I give to text. I'm not sure how to categorize. Not a journalist. Journalists don't message like this. Not a troll. The account was too sparse and too specific. Something else. Someone who knew something. I typed 3 words. Yes. Who's asking? Then I put the phone face down on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling for a long time, wondering whether the truth when it finally arrived would hurt more or less than not knowing. The wedding, I found out later, had taken place in late March at the Grand New York property. A small ceremony private enough to avoid a press release, formal enough to change the name on the legal documents. By the time the trade pages caught up, they were already Mercers. Both of them. Paige Beaumorn. It took me half a second to place the name. And then everything from the 3rd floor of Emerson Hall came back in full resolution. She had replied to my message at 7:46 the following morning. Not a long reply. Just a phone number and 1 sentence. "If you're open to talking. I think video is better than text for this." I sat with it over coffee for 10 minutes. Turned it over the way you do when you're deciding whether to walk towards something important or something strange. And then I called. She picked up on the 2nd ring. The screen opened into a small, bright studio space in Portland canvases, stacked flat against the wall behind her. A half-finished painting on an easel to one side. A wide window with the particular logo light that belonged specifically to the Pacific Northwest. In March, Paige was in her early 30s. I would have placed her there without knowing, haircut shorter than I remembered from college, wearing a sweater that had clearly met paint before. She looked exactly like what her account profile had suggested. A working artist with no particular interest in performing otherwise. "Sarafina," she said. Not a question. Paige. I adjusted the laptop screen. It's been a long time. It has. She looked at me steadily with the kind of directness that skips handshake pleasantries by mutual agreement. I want to say first I'm sorry about what's happening. I saw some of the coverage. I wouldn't have reached out if I didn't think what I know actually matters. Then tell me, I said. She didn't ease into it. The woman in that photograph. The one they're calling Genevieve Whitmore. She paused for exactly one beat. Her name is Gladys Pewitt. She lived on our floor. Room 318. End of the hall. You and I were 2 doors apart all of freshman and sophomore year. And she was 14 rooms down. And I don't think I ever once saw her in the dining hall. The name came up slowly. The way something does when it's been left undisturbed at the bottom of a drawer. Gladys Pewitt. Room 318. I began assembling her from whatever I still had. She had always seemed smaller than she probably was. Something to do with how she held herself. Oversized sweaters in washed-out colors regardless of the temperature. Hair fine and light. Usually pulled back in a way that suggested it had been done once that morning and not thought about since. She had skin that gave her trouble visible even at hallway distance. Even without looking directly at her. Which she seemed to prefer. People didn't do. She ate alone. She moved through the corridor with her head angled down like someone who had made a private calculation about the cost of being noticed and decided it wasn't worth it. I remember her. I said. Not well. We never spoke. Almost nobody did, not because she was unfriendly. She was just very closed off. Like she was waiting for something about her life to change and hadn't figured out what it was yet. Paige curled both hands around her mug. Junior year. She got reported to the Academic Integrity Committee. She'd submitted portfolio work that didn't belong to her, design pieces from 3 other students in the program. Rework just enough to blur the sourcing. The school gave her a formal hearing. The standard review process. But she couldn't produce an explanation that held up under the panel. She was expelled before the end of the semester. I didn't know that. It wasn't widely announced. The school doesn't publicize individual disciplinary outcomes. FERPA protections. So, that part stays private. I only knew because one of the students whose work she used was someone I spent time with. She set her mug down. After that, I lost track of her completely. 6 or 7 years ago, a friend shared a piece about Manhattan Society. The usual charity circuit coverage. And there was a photograph of a woman being described as Genevieve Whitmore. A philanthropist. All of it. And something made me stop completely. She looked at me. It was the eyes. Whatever else she changed. And she changed a great deal. She couldn't change the eyes. Show me. I said. She reached off screen without ceremony and came back with her phone. Then shared her screen. 2 photographs appeared side by side. On the left, a low-resolution image from what I estimated was a college event. Probably 2009 or 2010. The grain and color quality of an early smartphone camera. Gladys Pewitt caught half-turned from the lens holding a plastic cup with both hands. Round face. Acne concentrated at the chin and forehead. A nose broad and flat in a way that dominated the center of her face. Eyes small and somewhat closely set. But with a very particular shape at the outer corners. A specific quality where the upper lid met the lower. A slight downward angle at the outer edge. On the right, Genevieve Whitmore at the charity auction photograph I had found in my own search. Laughing at something off frame. Head tilted at a very slight downward angle as she smiled. The architecture of the face on the right had been rebuilt comprehensively enough that without the reference, no one would have found the path between them. The nose alone was unrecognizable. The jaw had been reshaped. The cheekbones. The structure of the chin. The overall proportions reworked with the kind of skill and investment that takes years and a specific category of income to arrange. But the outer corners of the eyes were the same. Exactly the same. And then I saw the gesture. The particular angle of her head as she laughed. Chin dropping forward and slightly down, a small practice deflection. As if some residual part of her still preferred not to be fully in frame. Even in a moment of open expression. I had looked at that gesture 2 weeks ago in a different photograph and felt it snag in me like a word I couldn't bring to the surface. Not the face. The gesture. Now I had the surface. I see it, I said. Paige nodded. I sat on this for 6 years because I didn't know what to do with it. But when I saw the two of them in the news and realized who you were. She shook her head slightly. It seemed like something a person deserves to know about the woman her ex-husband just married. We stayed on the call a little longer after that. She asked how I was holding up genuinely and without pressing. I gave her the outline. The proceedings. The apartment luminary. Keeping me anchored. She listened well. Before we said goodbye, she told me to reach out if I needed to. And the way she said it meant she'd actually pick up. I sat afterward with the 2 screenshots open on my phone. Gladys Pewitt and Genevieve Whitmore placed side by side and held the information for a long time. The way you hold something fragile until you're confident of your grip. One answer was in place. One piece of the picture finally named. But the more I sat with it, the more a different kind of unease took shape behind it. Something entirely separate from Gladys. I had been looking at press photographs of Julian for weeks now. The gala. The trade coverage. The particular way he positioned himself relative to a camera. And something about his face had been snagging at me in exactly the same register. The same quality of unease. The same sense of a pattern I recognized without knowing yet from where. After the call, I sat for a long time with the 2 photographs open beside each other. One mystery placed and named. But the more I looked at Julian's face in those press photos, the more I felt something stir something that had nothing to do with Gladys Pewitt. Something I couldn't name yet. Something I was going to have to find on my own. There are things a person changes about themselves. A haircut. A city. A name. And then there are things that take years, money, and a very specific kind of shame to erase entirely. I spent the first 2 weeks of April dismantling the apartment piece by piece, which turned out to be less about physical labor than about confronting the inventory of a life that had never quite been shared the way I'd understood it to be. Julian had arrived in the apartment with a fully formed aesthetic and a very clear idea of what the space was going to look like. And I had moved into his vision the way you move into a neighborhood because it's practical and find yourself 5 years later not entirely sure when you stop noticing that it wasn't yours. Most of what I was boxing up was mine in origin. My books. My research materials. My restoration tools and reference folders, and barely registered in the overall visual of the apartment. The absence of Julian's things was the more noticeable absence. The art was gone. The custom furniture. The framed architectural photography. Without those pieces, the apartment looked like what it had always been. A very expensive space that had been waiting for someone to decide who they were. He had taken the main pieces efficiently, if not entirely thoroughly. The bookshelf held gaps between my remaining books. The wall in the living room showed the clean rectangle where a large print had hung, the outlines still faintly present in the paint. He had moved quickly, and quickly always leaves something behind. I came to the study last. It was a small room north-facing that Julian had used for paperwork and calls and the particular kind of quiet that men with his level of self-possession require on a regular basis. His desk, walnut clean-lined, built for someone with very deliberate taste, had been collected early in the move. What remained in the room were the objects that hadn't made it into any box. A small reading lamp on the floor that nobody had claimed, 2 architectural magazines from 2020 that must have slid behind the door, and the desk drawers which I now opened one by one. The top 2 were empty. Wiped clean. The bottom drawer, the deep one, stuck slightly when I pulled it. The track was slightly warped from the building's old heating system. And when I managed to pull it all the way out to inspect the back, it caught. Something was wedged in the far rear corner, pressed flat against the back panel of the drawer. I reached in and pulled it out. An envelope the color of cream that has been in sunlight too many times and gone the yellow of old bone. The paper had a slightly different texture. The faint warp of something that has been cold and then warm across a few too many seasonal changes. On the front, a return address typed in small plain font: Earl Holloway, 14 Ridgeline Road, Harland County, Kentucky. No name on the recipient's side. Only AP.O. Box number in a part of Midtown I didn't recognize. The postmark read, December 2013. The flap had been opened and then closed again. Not torn. Not resealed. Tucked. The way you close something you've read and don't know what to do with. I held it for a while. Then I opened it. One page handwritten in the print of someone who doesn't write letters regularly and approaches the task with the concentration it deserves. Each character formed a little more carefully than the last, as though the writer was aware of being watched by the permanence of ink on paper. Block print slightly uneven, spacing the lines drifting gently up toward the right margin. He asked whether Travis was planning to be home for Christmas. He mentioned that the back fence line needed redoing after the September rains, that the Garner family down the road had finally sold their property, that the winter had come early this year and was already cold enough in November to see your breath in the morning. The information a person from a small place sends to someone who has left it to keep a thread attached. At the bottom in the same careful block print as everything before it, your mama still sets a plate for you every Sunday. I just thought you should know that. Dad. The letter had been read. The crease at the fold was soft, worn slightly, the way a fold becomes when a piece of folded paper has been opened more than once. Someone had read it at least twice and then put it here at the back of a drawer where it would be looked at exactly as often as the person who put it there felt capable of looking at it, which was apparently never again. I sat down on the floor of the empty study with the letter in my lap and said the name quietly to no one in particular. Travis. I took out my phone. Travis Holloway. Harlan County, Kentucky. The Facebook profile came up on the third search variation. I tried an account created in 2006, last active in the spring of 2011 and untouched since. The profile photograph was the final one uploaded, a young man in his early 20s photographed in flat outdoor light, looking slightly to the side of the camera with the mild discomfort of someone who doesn't normally stand still to be photographed. His nose was broader than Julian's, not large, simply unaltered, carrying the soft asymmetry that features have before a surgeon has touched them. His jaw followed a rounder line along the lower edge. His chin was fuller, more proportional to the rest of his face in the way that faces are proportional before anyone decides they shouldn't be. But the eyes, the particular angle at the outer corners, the quality of the upper lid, the specific way the brows sat above them were Julian's eyes exactly, completely and unmistakably. I found the newspaper piece another 15 minutes into the search. An archived article from the Harlan County Dispatch dated August 2008. A brief report on a property boundary dispute between adjacent landowners. The kind of story that exists because a local paper records the facts of a community for that community and no one outside it. 3 paragraphs in the middle of the second. Earl Holloway, a blacksmith and small plot farmer who has worked the land since 1987, appeared before the county board with his son Travis to contest the surveyed boundary line. Travis Holloway ceased to appear in any public record after the first quarter of 2011. Julian Mercer's name appeared for the first time in a Manhattan trade publication in early 2012. A mention of a junior account manager at a boutique beauty marketing firm, described as a promising new addition to the industry. 1 year between the disappearance of one name and the emergence of another. Sufficient time barely for a face to be rebuilt and a history to be constructed and a man to arrive somewhere new and present himself as someone who had always been there. I set the phone down, looked up at the wedding portrait still on the study wall. Julian hadn't taken it, either because he'd forgotten or because keeping it would have required him to decide what it meant. He was looking at the camera with that expression I had spent 3 years reading as confidence and was now reading differently. The expression of a man who has rehearsed himself so thoroughly that the rehearsal has become the performance and the performance has become indistinguishable from the person. He had rebuilt himself from the material he had, and so had she. Gladys Pewitt, now Genevieve Whitmore, walking through the world in a face she had commissioned, and a name she had selected, and a history that began at whatever point she'd decided it was convenient. 2 people who had decided the versions they'd been born into weren't adequate, and had done what was necessary to replace them. And I had married a fiction, lived alongside it for 3 years, made dinner for it, recovered from surgery in the same bed with it, believed on the specific night of February 14th that it was worth a seared duck breast and 2 hours of practice cherry reduction. I put the phone away. I photographed the Travis Holloway Facebook profile before closing the browser and saved a screenshot of the Harlan County Dispatch article and created a folder on my phone labeled Simply Reference and put both images in it. Then I folded the letter back into its envelope and smoothed the flap down without resealing it. I put the envelope in my bag. I carried it out of the apartment when I left. I'm not entirely sure why. Perhaps because it was the only thing in the entire place that had never pretended to be anything other than what it was. Or perhaps because something in the part of me that had spent 15 years working with source material was already sensing that this wasn't the end of the story, that whatever was coming next, I was going to want everything I'd found. Not today, but someday. The story wasn't finished yet. 6 months into this unraveling work was the one thing that still felt solid beneath my feet. I had moved into a smaller apartment on the Upper East Side by the end of April. A one-bedroom with a kitchen that looked out onto a courtyard and a lease that had only my name on it. The divorce proceedings were in their final stages. Rachel had filed everything in order, and we were waiting on the court's schedule. Outside of that, my life had consolidated into something leaner and more manageable than it had been in years. My work, my commute, my restoration projects on weekends, and the research I kept returning to in the evenings. The folder on my phone labeled reference, which I opened sometimes and looked at without doing anything with, still waiting for the moment to clarify itself. In late May, that moment sent an advanced notice. An email arrived in Luminary's editorial intake inbox from the PR director at Aurora Beauty. A formal proposal for a 4-page advertising campaign and accompanying editorial feature in the fall special issue. The subject of both the campaign and the feature Genevieve Whitmore framed as a portrait of natural beauty and authentic elegance. The proposal referenced Genevieve's philanthropic work, her family's hospitality legacy, her current role as a face of the brand. The language was polished and professionally meaningless in the way of most brand communications, but the visual concept was clear. They wanted Luminary's editorial weight behind the idea that what Genevieve Whitmore presented to the world was simply effortlessly exactly herself. My editor-in-chief assigned the account to me on a Tuesday morning without ceremony. I was the most experienced features editor on staff for luxury brand work, and the campaign was exactly the kind of thing I'd handled a dozen times. The assignment made sense by every professional metric. I waited until after the meeting. Then I knocked on her office door and closed it behind me. My editor-in-chief had been running Luminary for 11 years. Long enough that almost nothing surprised her. And most things warranted at most a measured response. She looked up from the layout she was reviewing and waited. "There's something you need to know before I touch anything on this account," I said. "Julian Mercer. The Aurora Beauty contact is my ex-husband. We separated in February and the divorce proceedings are in their final stages. I want you to have that information now, not later." She set down her pen. "I'll step back entirely if you'd prefer someone else to lead this," I added. "I wanted to give you the option." She looked at me for a moment with the particular quality of attention she gives to things she's still deciding on. Not cold, not warm, simply precise. Then she said, "You're the most qualified person we have for luxury brand features. I'm not reassigning this because of your personal history, but I need you completely professional on this. No editorial decisions that wouldn't survive daylight. And I want a paper trail on every call and approval." "Understood. I'll send a follow-up to the record by end of day." True to her word, an email arrived in my inbox at 4:47 that afternoon. A 3-line confirmation that she was aware of the personal connection, that she had reviewed and approved my continued involvement, and that all account decisions should be documented. I archived it carefully. That afternoon, I reached out to the Aurora Beauty PR director and requested the full raw photo files for editorial review. This is standard practice in print publishing. Raw files are the unprocessed originals directly from the camera containing significantly more data than any compressed format. Essential for the print resolution required for a feature of this scale. Requesting them before editorial review is expected. The PR director sent a download link within the hour. 48 files. Each one shot at a resolution fine enough to examine a subject in detail that studio lighting and post-production routinely obscure. I opened them on the largest monitor in the editing suite after hours when the floor was quieter. I have worked with photographs in this industry for 9 years. I know what a face looks like in RAW. The unforgiving specificity of it. The way high-resolution unprocessed images document skin the way no retouched final can. I know what skin looks like at different ages in different lighting under different conditions. And I know what certain things look like when the camera captures them before a retoucher has the chance to decide that the client's brand story requires their absence. I found the first marker within minutes along the hairline behind the right ear, visible when I zoomed to full resolution on a 3/4 profile shot. A thin linear trace lighter than the surrounding skin following the curve of the ear into the hairline above it. A facelift incision, specifically the posterior extension of a rictomy where the skin has been lifted and resecured. Precise, professionally executed, and fully invisible to anyone looking at a compressed image at standard viewing size. The chin in direct light showed a slight subsurface irregularity in the lower central region. The kind of subtle topographic variation that indicates either significant dermal filler placed deep or a structural implant beneath where the overlying tissue doesn't quite move with the continuity of natural tissue. The nose bridge was geometrically straight in a way that natural cartilage rarely achieves. And when I overlaid a proportion guide, the bridge-to-tip ratio sat precisely at the aesthetic ideal that rhinoplasty consistently targets rather than landing in the slight imperfection that characterizes an unmodified nose. Behind the left ear, barely visible in a sidelight shot, a small curved scar in the cont, the donor site for auricular cartilage used in complex nasal reconstruction. A technique that leaves its mark exactly where I was looking at the outer corners of both eyes. In the highest magnification, I could manage a faint lateral tension, the particular quality of tissue that has been repositioned and held the residue of canthopexy or possibly a lateral brow lift with temporal incision. Not dramatic, barely perceptible, but present. I opened the photograph Paige had sent me 6 weeks earlier on my phone and set it beside the monitor. Gladys Pewitt, 2009. The nose that had since been entirely rebuilt. The chin that had been reshaped. The brows repositioned. The skin lifted, the cartilage of her own ear harvested and used to reconstruct a different face. Everything that face had been was here in the raw files. Written in the language that surgery always leaves, the language that gets erased in post-production, but never actually disappears. I exported all 48 files to an encrypted folder on the secure editorial server and gave it a label that would mean nothing to anyone who happened to see it. Archive brand reference. Then I set up the production folder structure for the campaign. 2 directories clearly named original_client_submission into which I moved the 48 raw files and final approved which I left empty. The second folder was where Aurora Butte's team would eventually need to deliver their retouched brand approved finals before our print deadline. Standard process. The folder was ready and waiting. I replied to the PR director with 11 words. Thank you for the files. We'll review and be in touch. Then I closed the monitor, gathered my things, and left the office. I saved those files. And for the first time since Valentine's night, something moved through me that was neither grief nor anger. Something quieter than either. More patient. I had the feeling that the moment for those files would come. That it was already somewhere ahead in the timeline. Fixed and waiting. I simply didn't yet know what form it would take when it arrived. Somewhere between filing motions and running deadlines. Summer arrived in New York. And I forgot briefly in the way you briefly forget a bruise when you're busy enough to be devastated. The city does that. It gives you subway platforms and coffee lines and the particular ambient noise of a place that runs on ambition. And if you're a person whose livelihood requires showing up with your thinking intact, you show up. The grief doesn't disappear. It just recedes to the back of the room while you handle the things in front of you. And you learn not to be ashamed of that arrangement. The court date was in mid-July. Rachel had spent 5 months building the case with the methodical thoroughness I had come to associate with everything she put her name on. She had documented each of the 8 transfers out of the joint account, cross-referenced them against Julian's calendar and corporate filings, and built a timeline that placed every transaction squarely within the period of my surgery and recovery. She had also subpoenaed Aurora Butte's records, showing that no formal consulting agreement had ever existed between the company and Genevieve Ellis Whitmore LLC, which meant that Julian's description of the transfers as legitimate business expense had no paper foundation whatsoever. The courtroom in Lower Manhattan was smaller than I had expected and less dramatic. A judge, 2 attorneys, a court reporter. The hum of an air conditioning system slightly too loud for the room. I sat beside Rachel in a grey blazer I had worn to enough professional meetings that it felt like armor. And I listened to the proceedings with the focused attention I give to any document I need to understand before I can do anything with it. Julian's attorney offered 2 arguments. The first was that the transfers represented good faith reimbursement for creative services legitimately rendered. Rachel dismantled this in approximately 4 minutes by presenting the complete absence of any signed contract, invoice, or deliverable associated with the payments. The second was that disbursements from a joint account were the prerogative of either account holder. Rachel acknowledged this and then explained with the precise economy of someone who has made this argument before and intends to make it convincingly that the prerogative of account access does not exempt a spouse from accountability for the deliberate transfer of marital funds to benefit an extramarital relationship, particularly when those transfers occurred during a period of documented medical incapacity for the other spouse. The judge ruled in my favor. He awarded the return of $300,000. The remaining $150,000 he noted was held within Genevieve Ellis Whitmore LLC and would require separate civil proceedings to recover, given that the LLC was a distinct legal entity not directly party to the divorce. Rachel had already told me this outcome was likely. It was less than the full amount and more than nothing. And I had learned over the previous 6 months to work accurately within the range of what was actually available rather than what I wished were true. Outside afterward on the sidewalk in a July heat that pressed down from every direction at once, Rachel handed me a copy of the judgment paperwork. The wire will process in 10 business days. She said, $300,000 minus fees. Thank you, I said. And meant it in the full and particular way you thank someone who has spent months carrying a weight you couldn't carry yourself. There's someone I want you to meet, she said before I could turn to go. Not related to the divorce. Something separate. Can you do coffee next week? His name was Marcus Webb. He worked out of a small, precisely organized office on the 44th floor of a building in the financial district. The kind of space that communicates competence without ostentation, which is its own kind of signal. His desk was clear except for the materials relevant to whatever conversation was happening. His suits were expensive and unshowy. He had the manner of someone who has answered every obvious question so many times that he no longer needs to waste energy on establishing credibility. Rachel had described him accurately. He specialized in minority stake placements in private funds ahead of IPO events. Essentially, he helped clients identify and access investment vehicles that weren't yet available to the general market, and he structured the terms of entry to give those clients position and, when appropriate, a formal role. She said you had a situation, he said once the introductions were done, and that you might be interested in a particular vehicle. Tell me what you know about Aurora Collective. I knew what I had found through my own research. A cosmetics venture fund that had been quietly aggregating capital and brand partnerships for the past 2 years, with Julian Mercer and Genevieve Whitmore Mercer among its key strategic investors. Marcus confirmed the rest. The fund was currently in its second round of institutional investment. A public offering was projected within 18 months pending market conditions. The current pre-IPO valuation places a minority advisory position at approximately $280,000. A fractional stake in a fund whose total pre-IPO capitalization Marcus had put at just under $900 million. That stake came with a formal designation, advisory board member, brand and editorial division. I sat with the number for a moment. What does the advisory board position actually entail? I asked. Quarterly reviews, brand direction, input, attendance at board sessions. For a fund in the luxury beauty space, having an editorial voice with your specific background gives the advisory board credibility it currently lacks. The other members are financiers and brand executives. No one in that room has spent 15 years deciding what actually resonates with the people who spend money on this category. So my credentials function as the investment's legitimacy. I said, your credentials function as the reason the other board members don't look too carefully at a new name on the list. He said it without any apparent irony. The fund has been signing off on advisory appointments in batches. Your documentation goes in as S. Callaway Brand Advisory. Nothing about that name is going to raise any flags for the people currently managing the account. I looked at the paperwork he'd laid in front of me. $280,000, a minority position in a fund approaching 9 figures in pre-IPO capitalization. The same money Julian had moved out of our joint account while I was lying in a hospital recovery room, now sitting in a wire transfer from a court judgment available and waiting. I'd like to proceed. I said I signed the authorization that afternoon. Marcus said he would handle the placement, the documentation, and the board registration. I thanked him and took the elevator back down 44s and stepped out into the financial district heat, and then walked the 4 blocks to the subway and took it uptown. The apartment was waiting. It was smaller than the penthouse by half. And the kitchen window looked into a courtyard rather than a skyline. And the closets were not the walk-in kind. But the lease had one name on it. And the furniture was arranged the way I had arranged it. And when I sat down at the table that evening with a glass of water and the copy of the court judgment and the signed authorization for my advisory position, I felt something I had not felt in a very long time, sitting at a table. Like this one was actually mine. Marcus told me the acquisition would take 3 to 4 months to fully clear. I marked the projected date in my planner, closed it, and turned the page. What I didn't know then was that by the time those papers came through, something far more unexpected would arrive first. And it would come in the form of a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. Before I tell you about the phone call that arrived on a quiet Tuesday night in September, a call that changed everything I thought I understood about this situation, I need to know you're still with me. Drop 214 in the comments right now. That's the date where all of this began. Let me see you there. A note: what follows weaves in some fictional elements built for storytelling and perspective. If this kind of content isn't for you, this is a perfectly good place to step away. No judgment at all. It was a Tuesday in September. One of those early autumn evenings when New York finally exhales after a summer that had asked too much of everyone, when my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I was at the kitchen table with a stack of November galley proofs, a red pen, and a cup of tea I had made 30 minutes ago and let go cold. The galleys were for a features piece on sustainable luxury that I had commissioned in July and was only moderately satisfied with the lead needed work. And there was a structural repetition in the second section that the writer hadn't caught. I was good at this part of the job. I had always been able to see the problems in other people's work with a clarity that I was slowly over the past several months learning to apply to my own life as well. The number on the screen had a New Hampshire area code. I looked at it for a moment longer than necessary. Then I picked up. "It's me." Julian's voice. But stripped of something. Not the tone exactly, but the architecture beneath it. The controlled evenness I had lived alongside for 3 years and learned to mistake for steadiness. "Genevieve had the baby this morning. A girl." I said nothing. I pulled the galley I'd been working on in front of me and set the red pen down on top of it and waited. "She's healthy," he said after a moment. A pause, and then, "That's what the nurses keep saying. Healthy. All 10 fingers. That's good." I said yes. Another pause, longer. The particular silence of someone who has more to say and is deciding how to say it. "She doesn't look like either of us." I listened. Her left ear has a small fold in the upper cartilage. A little notch. The pediatric Ian called it minor. "Doesn't affect anything." He stopped. "And her face. The way the bones sit. Her eyes are set a little wider than you'd expect. The brow line is stronger. There's a slight leftward curve to the nose." He was describing it carefully, clinically, the way Julian always describes things when he is worked up about them and is trying not to show it. None of it is Genevieve, and it's not me, or at least it's not the me that anyone knows. He stopped. The line was very quiet for a moment. The me that anyone knows. The words landed and I held them with the same careful attention I'd given to the letter from Earl Holloway. Turned them over. Understood exactly what was underneath them. He had heard himself. I could tell from the silence that followed. "Why are you calling me Julian?" I asked. "Because you're the only person I have ever fully trusted." He said it without sentiment, almost flatly, as a statement of fact rather than feeling. "Even after everything. I don't know why that is. Maybe it shouldn't be. But I didn't know who else to call. I looked at the galley on the table. The red pen. The cold tea. He continued quietly, more carefully. Wide-set eyes. The brow ridge in the profile photos was already noticeable, pronounced in the way that some faces carry their expression in the forehead rather than the eyes. The nose's slight deviation, which the nurses had noted would likely straighten with growth, but which was currently unmistakable in the photographs on his phone. I knew exactly whose face he was describing. I had seen it once in the flat outdoor light of a photograph taken before a social media account went dormant in 2011. A young man looking slightly away from the camera. His nose broad and unmodified. His jaw carrying the rounder softness of a face no surgeon had yet refined his brow. Heavy in the way that faces are before you decide they shouldn't be. The photograph I had saved to a folder on my phone and labeled reference. I knew that face the way I knew certain recurring words in manuscript. Not by searching for it, but because it had been there already, waiting for the context that made it legible. What I also knew, and what Julian did not, was that Genevieve had no unmodified features left to pass down. Whatever genetics her child had received, they had not come from the face Genevieve currently wore. They had come from somewhere prior to Genevieve Whitmore. From a woman named Gladys Pewitt, whose round face and close-set eyes existed now only in a low-resolution photograph from a college event in 2009 and in the cellular material she had given to this child she had not yet decided to name. Julian was looking at a baby who carried the original faces of both her parents expressed simultaneously through the logic of inheritance. And he had no idea. He thought he was looking at evidence of a betrayal. He was actually looking at the biological summary of two people who had each decided separately and in secret that the version of themselves they had been born into was insufficient. And I was the only person who understood the full geometry of it. Did you do a paternity test? I asked. Yes. Prenatal. A blood draw about 6 weeks before she was due. Non-invasive. Completely accurate. No hesitation. She's mine. The lab confirmed it 2 days before she was born. But I don't. He stopped again. I don't understand how this is possible. I keep looking at her. Sometimes genetic surfaces where we least expect it. I said features skip generations. Traits that haven't appeared in a family for decades can come forward in a child. The science is less predictable than people like to believe. A silence. Then do you know something I don't? I know that a child who doesn't look like either parent doesn't necessarily mean what you're afraid it means. I said that's all. That's not everything you know. Julian. I kept my voice very even. You called me at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday to tell me your wife had your daughter. I'm glad the baby is healthy. But whatever you're working through right now, I'm not the person who can work through it with you. Serafina. Good night. Julian. I ended the call. Set the phone on the counter. Stood at the kitchen window for a moment, looking at the lit windows of the building across the courtyard. Other apartments. Other evenings. Other people inside them doing whatever it was they did on Tuesday nights in September. The city hummed on exactly as it always does. Indifferent to the fact that across several state lines in a hospital room in New Hampshire, a baby girl was being measured and weighed and wrapped in a standard issue hospital blanket. Assessed by nurses who were noting her features on a chart and finding them unremarkable by clinical standards. She had no name yet. She had no idea this child whose existence had been set in motion months before anyone bothered to tell the first wife that the marriage was already over, that she was in this particular moment in her very new life the most honest person in any room she was in. In the weeks that followed, Paige kept me updated through the particular kind of intelligence network that exists only between women who once shared a dormitory floor. A loose web of mutual contacts and forwarded messages that operates quietly and with remarkable accuracy. She had a friend in the New York art world, a sculptor with a studio in Long Island City, who moved in circles adjacent to the philanthropic set that Genevieve Whitmore had long counted as her social atmosphere. This friend was a member of several private social groups online, the kind of closed forums where the parameters for entry are narrow enough that members feel safe being candid. In the second week of October, Paige's contact forwarded her a screenshot of a post from one such group. An anonymous entry from someone describing, without naming names, A new mother and her acquaintance who had declined to share a hospital room with her newborn, who had arranged for 2 private night nurses from the first evening of the stay, and who had reportedly not held the child once during her 3-day hospitalization. The post had attracted 40 own replies, most of them a mixture of sympathy and bewilderment. The poster had supplied no identifying details. They didn't need to. Paige sent me the screenshot with one line beneath it. "That's Genevieve. I'd bet my entire studio on it." I looked at the screenshot for a long time. Then I set my phone down, made coffee I didn't end up drinking, and stood at my kitchen window, watching the October light settle over the courtyard below. There was a particular quality to the light in New York. In early autumn, the same city, the same buildings, but something in the angle had shifted, and everything looked slightly more deliberate than it had in summer. The next morning, I called Julian. He answered on the first ring. That detail alone told me more than the rest of the conversation. Julian Mercer, who had never once answered a call on the first ring in 5 years of knowing him, who treated every incoming communication as something to be evaluated before engagement, answered before the second ring even completed. "How is she?" I asked. A short pause. Then he understood that I meant the baby, not Genevieve. "She's healthy," he said. He used the word the same way he'd used it on the phone last month, with the flatness of someone who has said it often enough that it's become a factual answer rather than a feeling. "The pediatric Ian says everything is developing normally. She's gaining weight the way she's supposed to." And Genevieve, the pause that followed was longer. I heard him move a chair maybe, or a door being closed. "She's back in the city." He said she came home 4 days after the birth. The baby is still in New Hampshire with the nurses, where the arrangement is still being worked out. I waited. "She said the baby's face looks like a stranger." He said it in the same careful, deliberate way he had described the baby's features to me 6 weeks ago. Clinical language over something he clearly didn't know what to do with. Her exact words. "Not like Julian. Not like me. Like a stranger. She doesn't recognize anything in it." A pause. "She keeps saying that. I don't recognize anything in it. What does she mean by that?" "I don't know." He said it too quickly to be true. "I don't know if she's saying it because she believes something happened that didn't, or if she's saying it for another reason entirely. She won't come out and say it directly." He stopped. "And you can't ask her to explain herself." I said, "Not directly." "No." I understood exactly what lived in that pause between the sentence and what came after it. I had been thinking about it since that Tuesday night in September, turning the geometry of it over in the way I turn over a complex editorial problem when I can see all the moving parts, but haven't yet written the piece that accounts for them. Julian could not ask Genevieve to explain her suspicion directly, because answering his own version of that question, "Where exactly did this face come from?" would require him to surface a history he had spent 12 years erasing. He could not point to genetics on his own side without Genevieve eventually asking which side and from where and from how far back. Every question he could legitimately raise led back to himself. And Genevieve, for her part, could not press the accusation she was clearly holding, because pressing it meant Julian would eventually push back, and Julian would ask about her family, her history, her genetic material, and that conversation would end somewhere she could not afford to go. 2 people sitting on the same set of buried facts with the same inability to speak freely for the same category of reason. The child in New Hampshire being cared for by strangers was the proof of both their secrets, and neither of them could acknowledge it without unraveling their own story. The baby had not chosen any of this. That was the part one kept coming back to. "What's her name?" I asked. Julian was quiet for a moment. "We haven't decided. Genevieve keeps saying she needs more time." More time. As though the child's name was something to delay until the child became easier to look at. "All right," I said. "Sarafina." His voice had that quality it sometimes got when the composure was working hard. Even deliberate. Slightly too careful. "Do you think there's any explanation for this that I've missed?" I thought about what I knew. About the photograph saved to a folder on my phone. About the low-resolution image from a college event in 2009. About what it means when 2 people each carry a secret they've never told anyone, including the person they chose to build a life with. And what happens when those two secrets produce a child who simply has the biological honesty neither parent was willing to sustain? I think I said that most of the things we can't explain have an explanation. We just sometimes don't want to be the one who finds it. He didn't say anything to that. I told him I hoped things settled and I ended the call. I sat at my kitchen table for a while afterward without doing much of anything. The morning news was playing from the other room. Something about the markets. Something about the weather. And I was not listening to any of it. I was thinking about a hospital in New Hampshire. About a small room. About a child in a bassinet who had been attended to with professional competence by people who were paid to be there and who would go home to their own lives at the end of the shift. She had no name yet. She had no mother in the room. She had a father who answered phone calls on the first ring and could not ask the one question that might have made everything make sense. She had not chosen the people who made her. None of us do. That's the whole of it. Really. We arrive in the middle of stories already in progress and spend the rest of our lives making sense of the chapters we inherited. I looked at my hands on the table. The surgical scar on my neck had faded to the point where I sometimes forgot it was there for hours at a time. Healed. Fully. Functionally. Irreversibly healed. I thought about that for a while before I got up to pour the cold coffee down the drain and wash the cup. I went to bed early that night. But sleep didn't come for a long time. I kept thinking about the encrypted files on my work laptop. The raw photographs. The folder architecture I had built in June. The slot labeled final approved that was still empty. Still waiting for a delivery that had never come. And I thought about what my editor once told me early in my career about the difference between a story that's ready and a story that's still gathering itself. You don't decide the time. The material does. Every truth buried long enough eventually finds its own way back to the surface. I lay in the dark and wondered how much longer this one had left to travel. November in New York comes quietly. The light drops earlier. The streets thin out and the city pulls its coat a little tighter against whatever is coming next. Marcus Webb called on a Wednesday morning in early November before I had finished my coffee. I had been awake since 6 working through a draft of the January profile I was editing, and the early call was not unwelcome. With Marcus, calls were brief and informative and never wasted time on preamble. Everything cleared this morning, he said. You're officially listed S. Callaway Brand Advisory. Your minority advisory position in Aurora Collective is confirmed. I sat down my coffee cup. Do they know my name yet? It's listed as S. Callaway. No first name. On the advisory register, which is standard for the class of board designation you hold. Julian Mercer's team reviewed and signed off on all new advisory appointments as a batch about 2 weeks ago. A brief pause. As far as I can tell, nobody looked particularly closely at the names. What do my board rights look like? I'm sending you the summary now. In short, attendance at quarterly board sessions. Access to brand direction memos ahead of publication, consultative vote on editorial and content partnerships. He paused. You have a seat and a voice. Not veto power, but sufficient presence that your position cannot be ignored without procedural violation. The confirmation email arrived while I was still on the phone. Crisp legal language. The Aurora Collective seal in the header. My name listed under brand and editorial advisory alongside 3 other designations I didn't recognize. The rights were enumerated in a numbered list that read like a standard board appointment and contained in its 3rd item the phrase editorial content decisions, which I read twice before moving on. I thanked Marcus and hung up. Then I sat at my kitchen table for a while with the confirmation on my screen. Reading it the way I read any document that changes the landscape of a situation, carefully beginning to end. Noting what it said and what it didn't say and where the useful spaces lived between the two. The physical envelope arrived that afternoon at the Luminary mail room. It was addressed in formal script to S. Callaway Brand Advisory Aurora Collective and routed to me through the editorial coordinator, who left it on my desk with the usual afternoon correspondence without any particular comment. I didn't open it until the editorial meeting had cleared. The card inside was ivory stock engraved rather than printed. The kind of formal invitation that announces its intentions before you've read a word of it. The Grand Hotel Group cordially invites you to the annual Legacy Gala December 10th, 2022. The Pierre Hotel, 5th Avenue. Black tie. At the bottom in smaller type. A celebration of heritage, legacy, and the art of authentic presence. Authentic presence. I read that twice as well. I set the card face up on my desk and looked at it for a moment. The Pierre was one of the most photographed venues in Manhattan corner of 5th Avenue and 61 St. Street. The kind of address that meant something to people for whom addresses meant something. In December, with the park lit below it, and the season in full effect, it would be precisely the setting that Julian and Genevieve's world had been designed to inhabit. I was going to need a gift. I had written a piece for Luminary 14 months earlier. A short profile on a collaborative of makers in Brooklyn who specialized in what they called artisan portrait miniatures. Small-scale figurative sculptures worked primarily in wax and resin, detailed enough to carry likeness, subtle enough to function as objects rather than spectacle. The piece had run in the makers section of the August issue. I remembered the studio well. A repurposed industrial space near the BQE. The founders, two women in their 40s with exacting standards and a timeline that they had described to me during our interview as long as it takes and not a day longer. I found them in my contact archive and opened a new email. The commission was detailed. I always work this way. Specificity prevents misunderstanding, and misunderstanding in custom work is expensive in both directions. I described the format. 2 portrait miniatures, small scale, intended to stand on individual walnut bases no larger than a paperback book. I specified the materials: wax with a matte finish. Skin tones worked from the reference photographs I would provide. The expressions neutral, facing forward. The kind of stillness that suggests the subject is aware of being looked at. The first subject. A young man. Early 20s. The nose carrying the soft asymmetry natural to an unmodified face. The jaw rounded along its lower edge without architectural sharpening. The brow heavy and unmarked by the kind of elevation that takes surgical intervention to achieve. I attached the photograph from the dormant Facebook profile I had saved to my phone the previous April. The young man in flat outdoor light looking just past the camera. The second subject. A young woman, early 20s. The face rounder at the cheekbone. The nose wider at the bridge in the way that faces are before they've been restructured. The eye shape carrying the particular closeness that contact lenses and clever lighting can mitigate but cannot alter. I attached the photograph Paige had sent me in March, the college event image. Low resolution. The woman half turned away from the lens with a plastic cup in both hands. No names. No context. Only the photographs and the measurements and the rendering specifications. At the base of each piece, I requested a small brass plate engraved in a surf face. 3 words centered. Originals always. I noted at the bottom of the email that I was prepared to pay a premium for delivery before December 8th and asked them to confirm receipt and timeline within 48 hours. Then I read the email through once from beginning to end. The way I read everything before I send it. Looking for anything that didn't belong. Anything that could be misread. Anything that didn't serve exactly the purpose it was intended to serve. Everything was in order. I sent the order to the wax studio and closed my laptop. Outside, November had settled into the particular shade of grey it holds between mid-mon and the first frost. Not unpleasant. Just deliberate. The sky. Deciding what it was going to be before committing. I sat at my kitchen table in the quiet of the apartment that was entirely mine and looked at the invitation card where I had left it. The Pierre. 5th Avenue. December 10th. Let them have their gala. I had a gift to prepare. And I was going to make absolutely certain it was something no one in that room would be able to forget. I did not attend the gala. I didn't need to. My gift arrived on my behalf at exactly 7:45 in the evening. Just as the second round of champagne was being served to 300 guests in the grand ballroom of the Pierre. I was home in a wool sweater with the February issue galleys spread across my coffee table. Red pen in hand. Working through a piece on the resurgence of repair culture in American fashion. The apartment was quiet. I had made tea. The December cold was pressing against the windows. And the radiator was ticking with the particular rhythm of old buildings trying their best. Paige had been invited through a sculptor she knew from the broader New York art network. A contact who moved in the periphery of the Grand's philanthropic circle. And had asked if she wanted a +1 for the evening. Paige had said yes. which was the arrangement I had been quietly hoping for since early November without saying so directly. Her first message came in at 7:51. Something just got carried up to the presentation table box big enough to be a centerpiece. Walnut. I think. Very formal. I underlined a sentence in the fashion piece that wasn't working and wrote a note in the margin. They're describing it as a gift from an admirer. Someone's reading the card aloud. An admirer of authentic legacy. Whoever wrote that. Well done. At 8:14. The box was opened on a small stage at the front of the room where the event director had been presenting the evening's ceremonial elements to the assembled guests. Inside the carved walnut case nested in dark velvet. 2 wax portrait miniatures, each on its own small walnut platform facing forward. Page's next message arrived in 3 parts 20 seconds apart. Oh my God. Oh my God. Serafina. What did you do? What the guests saw in the warm and unforgiving light of the Pierre's ballroom chandeliers were 2 faces rendered in wax with the kind of accuracy that stops being flattery and becomes something else entirely. Wax is honest material. It holds everything you give it and softens nothing. The first figure was a young man, mid-20s. The nose broad and slightly asymmetric in the way that noses are before anyone has decided they require correction. The jaw following a natural line that hadn't been sharpened along its lower edge. The brow ridge heavy and uninterrupted. The skin had been rendered with the texture of youth. Poorly managed. Not cruelty. Just truth. The kind of face you find in old photographs before the subject learned better lighting. The overall effect was of someone you almost recognized. Someone who looked from certain angles. Like someone you knew. But assembled from different proportions. Like that person before they'd been finalized into the version you'd come to accept as real. The second figure was a young woman. The cheeks fuller and lower than you might expect. The nose wider at the bridge. The skin surface modeled with a specificity that the wax medium made inescapable the uneven terrain. The crater shadow of old acne along the jaw and chin. The slight prominence of pores that no one thinks to request removed when they commission a portrait because portraits are supposed to be kind. The eyes sat closer together than current photographs suggested. The expression was neutral. The mouth slightly parted, the overall silhouette the shape of someone who had not yet decided or not yet had the means to become someone else. 2 faces. No names. No explanation. Between them. A small brass plate in a clean Sif face, originals always. Genevieve has gone completely still. Page's message came in at 8:22. I mean completely. She isn't blinking. Julian. Julian is looking at the second figure and his face is, I don't know how to describe it. He looks like he's trying to solve an equation and is not going to like the answer. They are moving. He has her arm. They're going toward the back exit. People are taking photographs. A lot of photographs. I count at least 15 phones up. Maybe more. The grandmother. Older Whitmore woman. Grey hair. Very upright. Just called 2 people over in a sharp whisper. Security or events? I can't tell. But the box is still on the stage. No one has moved it. Chaos. Real chaos. The kind people discuss at the next 4 parties. I set the galley down and looked at my phone for a moment. Then I picked up the pen and went back to the fashion piece. At 10:47, Julian called. I watched his name appear on the screen. I watched the call run through to voicemail. I picked up the red pen. At 11:02. He called again at 11:28. At 11:45. I marked a structural problem in the 3rd paragraph of the fashion piece and wrote myself a note. Cut the second example. It weakens the first. The radiator ticked. Outside. 5th Avenue carried on with its usual indifference to personal upheaval. At midnight. I put the galley down and picked up the phone. I listened to the last voicemail once and only once. Julian's voice came through sounding nothing like himself. The 3 years I had spent learning the cadence of that voice. The controlled modulation. The practiced ease of a man who had spent years deciding what version of himself the room needed to hear. All of it was gone. What remained was rawer. Rougher around the edges in the specific way of someone who has just seen something they weren't prepared to see. A man who looked at his reflection and didn't recognize the person looking back. Who had glimpsed across a ballroom full of people. two faces in wax. And understood without being able to say how. That the one he couldn't stop staring at was somehow connected to a past he had decided a very long time ago to stop existing. He said several things. I don't remember what specifically. The tone was what I retained. I deleted the voicemail, turned off the light, lay in the dark for a while with the apartment quiet around me, knowing the city was still out there doing its business, knowing that in a hotel on Fifth Avenue, the staff were probably still trying to manage the aftermath of 8:47 p.m. And I thought that's one kind of reminder. A small one. Personal. Contained in a box delivered by hand. Visible only to the people in that room. There's another kind of truth entirely. One that doesn't fit in a box. One that requires ink and paper stock and the specific weight of a print run when 3 million copies go out to newsstands from New York to Los Angeles on the same. I turned off the light. That version of the truth was still coming. And it was going to be considerably harder to put back in a box. The new year arrived with cold rain and the particular quiet of a city that had been loud for too long. January in New York after the holidays has a stripped-down quality. The decorations gone. The tourist foot traffic thinned, the avenues returned to their working selves. I found it clarifying. I had always worked better in January than in December. Less noise between a thought and its execution. Julian's email came through the board administration channel on the 2nd of January, routed through Aurora Collective's communications platform along with the standard pre-session documentation. Subject line: request for meeting prior to Q1 board session. The body of the message was 4 sentences, professional in register and very clearly composed with effort. He would like 15 minutes of my time before the full advisory meeting at my convenience at a location of my choosing as long as it was within the fund's facilities. He did not explain why. He didn't need to. I replied the same afternoon: board conference room, Aurora Collective, 18th floor, January 14 th 10 a.m. 15 minutes is sufficient. I arrived 12 minutes early. The building was a glass and steel address in Midtown. All clean sightlines. And the hushed efficiency of places that serve as the backdrop for large sums of money changing hands quietly. The 18th floor conference room was the primary board space. A long oval table in pale ash. 12 chairs, a wall of windows facing northeast over Midtown toward the midpoint of the park. I had attended one board session here already in November where I had listened carefully and said very little. Today I took the chair at the head of the table, set my bag beside it, and opened the meeting briefing documents. I didn't need to consult and read them anyway. When Julian walked in at 1 minute to 10, I was already there. He stopped just inside the doorway for 1 second longer than a person who is entirely comfortable stops. It was small. The kind of pause you notice when you have spent years learning the vocabulary of how a particular person occupies a room. Julian had always entered rooms as though they had been waiting for him to arrive. Today, the room had already been occupied, and someone was sitting at the head of it. And the geometry of everything he'd walked into was different from what he'd prepared for. I watched him recalibrate. He looked well enough. The suit was the right suit. The posture was being maintained with what I recognized as effort rather than ease. He had clearly slept less than he would have preferred. The composure was present, but structural rather than natural. The way a scaffolding is present on a building that is being worked on. He took the chair 4 positions to my right, not directly across the table from me, which would have implied a confrontation on equal terms. I noted that. "You didn't know it was me?" I said when he had sat down. "No." He said it without defensiveness, which surprised me. "I didn't know until the documentation for the November session came through with your full name on it." "I know." I set the briefing document to one side. "That's why the process worked." He looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't fully categorize. Not anger exactly. Something adjacent to it that had been processed through enough weeks of uncertainty that it had lost the sharpness. "I'd like you to sell the stake back," he said. "I'll arrange fair market compensation. The Funds Council can handle the paperwork within a month." "No. Serafina. The stake was acquired through the proper board approval channels," I said. "The investment was reviewed and signed off by the relevant parties. The name on the documentation is my legal name. There's no misrepresentation, no procedural violation. No basis for a forced sale. I looked at him evenly. If you have a legal argument for unwinding the position, have your attorneys write a letter. Rachel Holt will respond to it. He sat with that for a moment. What do you want from this? He said. Tell me plainly. Is it revenge? I want what any advisory board member is here for. I said brand integrity. Responsible stewardship of the fund's positioning. Those are the terms I accepted when I joined the board. And they're the terms I intend to operate under. I paused briefly given that the fund's most visible upcoming campaign positions Genevieve as a figure of authentic natural beauty. A claim that will be made explicitly in the luminary feature in the print campaign and in the associated editorial content. I have significant concerns about the evidentiary basis for those authenticity claims. I watched him understand. It moved across his face in stages. First the statement itself, registering, then the specific word evidentiary landing. Then the full geometry of what I had just said, arranging itself into its actual shape. He knew what I had access to. He had known since December almost certainly. The moment he traced the gift at the gala back to its source and understood the precision required to produce it. He knew I had worked with the campaign materials. He would have known or guessed exactly what those materials contained at their source level. He said nothing. I stood. I'll see you at the full board session, I said. I believe it's scheduled for the 22 ND. I gathered the briefing documents, slid them back into the folder, picked up my bag, and walked to the door. At the threshold, I paused, not for effect, but because the view through the glass partition stopped me briefly. Midtown from 18 floors in a January grey. The city's skyline running in both directions without any particular awareness of what had just happened in the room behind me. My reflection appeared in the glass as I stood there. The collar of my blazer had shifted slightly, and the scar along the left side of my neck was visible. The thin, pale line of it fully healed, precisely the size it had always been. I adjusted nothing. I left it exactly as it was. On the walk back to Luminary, I passed 3 news stands within 4 blocks. One of them was displaying a competitor's February issue, and Genevieve's face was on it, a 3/4 profile shot. The lighting engineered to present something clean and inevitable. The word radiant in the cover font above her left shoulder. I walked past it without slowing. I thought about print timelines, about the weight of a specific issue when the full run clears the warehouse and reaches news stands in 70 markets simultaneously, about the distance between a February galley session and a May cover date, and how much could be accomplished in that interval if the work had been building for nearly a year. Spring. I had already decided spring was the right time, and the work was nearly assembled. All that remained was the final piece, and that piece was almost in place. February is the cruelest month for pretense. The cold strips away everything decorative. The parties, the seasonal warmth, the social generosity that December manufactures, and January extends on credit. And what's left is exactly what was always there underneath. New York in February doesn't offer comfort. It offers clarity. Paige's first message came in the second week of the month, relayed through her New York contact. The word in certain social circles was that Genevieve had been seen at a private aesthetic medicine practice 3 times in the weeks immediately following the December gala. Not a spa. A clinic. The kind that operates by referral only and schedules appointments outside of normal business hours because the clients prefer not to be seen arriving or leaving. 2 procedures in 6 weeks. Paige wrote. Allegedly. My contact works adjacent to that world and says it's an open secret. I saved the message to my notes application without replying. I had been doing this since December, keeping a quiet log of the information that came to me through PA's network. Not because I needed it for anything immediate, but because the habit of documentation had served me well enough that I maintained it the way I maintain anything useful. On February 23 Road, Aurora Beauty launched what they were calling the Unveiled Skin Collection, a new skincare line developed according to their press materials to honor the radical authenticity of living in one's own skin without apology and without intervention. The launch was a live stream event hosted by Genevieve broadcasting from a studio in Chelsea. 340,000 people tuned in to watch in real time. I was one of them. I watched from my desk at Luminary with the February issue closed on my right and the stream open in a window on the left. The way I watch anything, I need to read carefully with my attention divided just enough that I'm not seeing what I'm meant to see, which is usually where the truth lives. Genevieve was in a structured ivory top under lights designed to flatter the warm to cool temperature blend that makes skin look healthy and rested rather than the harsh white pool that reveals everything it touches. For the first 12 minutes, she was composed and articulate, working through the product lineup with the fluency of someone who has done significant preparation. I watched the left side of her face. At approximately the 19th minute, the production director cut to a medium close-up for the segment on the serum. In that frame, in that light, something became apparent that had not been visible in the wider angles. The left cheek moved slightly out of synchronization with the right when she smiled. Not dramatically. Not in a way that a viewer not looking for it would necessarily have caught in real time. But noticeable. If you were watching with a trained eye and you understood what you were looking at. The left side arrived a fraction after the right and settled at a slightly different angle. The comments scroll began moving faster. By minute 20, the production team had widened out again. But the close-up had already done what it did. The live comments were quieter than before. The rhythm of a chat that has shifted from reactive engagement to watchful observation. A thing had snagged in the collective attention. And the audience was adjusting its focus without quite naming what had adjusted it. At minute 31, Genevieve picked up the hand microphone from the display table and extended her arm toward the camera, gesturing at the product lineup behind her. Under the direct studio light. At that angle, the skin just below her right ear, where the natural fold of tissue meets the jaw, showed a faint but distinct change in color. Not makeup undertone. Not shadow. The particular purplish yellow of recent bruising, not fully resolved, visible in the kind of light that no retoucher or filter reaches in time. The comment section fractured. Something is wrong with her face. The left side isn't moving the way it should. Is she okay? She looks uncomfortable. Can someone explain what's happening under her ear? At minute 44, Genevieve stopped mid-sentence. It lasted less than 2 seconds. A pause in the wrong place in the middle of a sentence that had not finished its thought, followed by a very deliberate stillness, and then visible clearly enough that multiple viewers screenshot it in the same instant her left hand came up. A single involuntary touch along the left side of her jaw below the cheekbone. Exactly where the muscle had not been moving correctly. Contact for perhaps 1 second, maybe less. Then her hand returned to her side and she finished the sentence and she smiled at the camera. But the comment scroll had already registered it. The live stream ended 14 minutes ahead of schedule. A graphic appeared in place of the feed. We are experiencing some technical difficulties. Thank you for joining us today. By 10 o'clock that evening, a 44-second clip spliced from the close-up at minute 19 through the moment at minute 44 had been uploaded to multiple platforms. It moved through the beauty and wellness community first, then into general circulation. By midnight, the hashtag was trending. Beauty analysts with followings in the hundreds of thousands were posting frame-by-frame breakdowns timestamped with annotations. The comment sections were very large and not particularly measured. Page's message arrived just before 11. The internet is not being kind tonight. I sat at my desk and watched the clip run through 3 times on a loop. The 44 seconds. The cheek. The ear. The hand. The second of contact she hadn't meant to be seen. I felt nothing that resembled satisfaction. What I felt was heavier than that and harder to name. And it had been forming slowly since the phone call from Julian last September, since I had sat in my kitchen listening to him describe a baby girl and had understood, in the way you understand things that are too large to process directly, the full weight of what 2 people do when they spend a decade running hard enough from themselves that they cannot stop even when everything has already gone wrong. Genevieve Whitmore had never been my enemy in the way enemies are supposed to function in stories like this. She was a woman who had looked at herself very young and found the looking unbearable and had done what she had the means to do about it and had kept doing it well past the point where it served her. Because stopping required a kind of reckoning she had never developed the capacity to face. What was happening on that screen tonight was not a consequence I had engineered. It was the conclusion I had watched building toward for months. The end of a trajectory that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with what happens when the thing you've been running from catches up. I closed the laptop, turned off my desk lamp, sat for a moment in the dark office with the city doing its business outside the window. 8 weeks. Give or take a few days. That was what remained between now and the print finalization deadline for the Luminary special issue. I had made a decision about that issue. A specific editorial decision that I had not yet shared with anyone. Not even with my editor-in-chief. Not in its final form. I had been carrying it quietly for several months. Turning it over the way you carry a piece of writing that isn't finished drafting itself yet. Watching the clip tonight, I understood that it had finished. Some decisions arrive through deliberate planning. Others you realize one evening were made long before you knew you were making them. There is a particular quality of focus that descends on a magazine office in the final weeks before a large issue locks something between exhaustion and a very specific, almost physical alertness. The way a room feels when everyone in it understands that the window for changing anything is closing and what remains is execution. March had moved into April with the steady indifference of a production calendar. The Luminary Spring special titled The Architecture of Beauty was in its final production weeks. 16 features, for cover options under review, and one 4-page advertising campaign from Aurora Beauty that was still technically in the pending column of the production schedule. The aftermath of the February live stream had not resolved quietly. Aurora Beauty had issued a statement within 48 hours. Genevieve was recovering well from a minor corrective procedure. Her health was excellent and the brand stood fully behind its commitment to authentic beauty. The statement was forwarded in at least 900 comment sections as evidence of something the brand had probably not intended to evidence. Aurora Collective's institutional investors had begun quietly re-evaluating their commitments. The pre-IPO fund's internal valuation had softened by double digits in under 3 weeks. Julian sent a message through the board communication channel on the 4th of March. I'm requesting an emergency session to address critical brand direction concerns. Immediate availability all advisory members. I replied the same afternoon. Emergency sessions under the fund charter require a minimum quorum of 4 advisory members to constitute a valid meeting. I have reviewed the availability of the full board and note that quorum cannot currently be achieved. I will be present at the next scheduled session per the calendar established in January. He did not respond. The emergency session did not convene. At Luminary, the production team was moving through the architecture of beauty in sections. The feature. Well, the editorial core of the issue included a long-form piece I had written over the course of 6 weeks examining the machinery of the modern beauty industry, the gap between what brands promise and what they can deliver, the biological limits of branding, the particular weight of campaigns built on claims of authenticity when the product behind the claim is a constructed image rather than a documented reality. The piece named no individuals. It was industry analysis rigorously sourced, editorially appropriate for the special issues theme. In the production queue, one item had been sitting in pending status since June of the previous year. The Aurora Beauty campaign package. The folder structure I had set up at the time of intake remained exactly as I had built it. One folder contained 48 raw image files. The unprocessed originals submitted by the brand's production team 10 months ago. The second folder labeled Final Approved was empty. The advertising contract Aurora Beauty had signed with Luminary, like all advertising contracts at the publication, contained a standard clause on print-ready materials. Final approved files must be submitted to the production team no later than 72 hours before the issue's print deadline. In the event that approved files are not received within that window, the production team will proceed using the most recently submitted client files on record. The print deadline for the architecture of beauty was April 19 at noon. At noon on April 16, the final approved folder remained empty. Aurora Beauty had not submitted their final retouched campaign files. They had not sent a request for extension. They had not been in contact with the production team regarding their advertising placements since October. They had in the intervening months managed a public live stream crisis, a statement to the press, an attempted emergency board session, and what I understood to be a considerable amount of internal reorganization. The deadline had passed through their field of vision and kept going unacknowledged. I had not reminded them. There was no contractual obligation requiring me to do so. The deadline was written into the agreement both parties had signed. I had offered no misinformation, no misdirection, no interference with their access to that information. I had simply been occupied with other aspects of production and the reminder had not been sent. The production team operating under standard procedure noted the absent files and pulled from what was on record. The 48 original RAW files were transferred from the client submission folder into the active production build for the issue's advertising section. Late on the evening of the 16th, my phone rang. The print director. We're confirming we'll be going with the original client submission for the Aurora campaign. She said. They missed the 72-hour window. Standard policy confirmed. I said. I held the final proof for approximately 4 minutes. The physical thing. The weight of it. The print quality of the studio-lit campaign photographs reproduced at full resolution across 4 pages next to the feature piece with its measured language and its industry-wide framing. I looked at it the way I look at anything I am done with carefully. Completely without revision. Then I put it down on my desk and gathered my coat and bag. I left the office at 11:47 that night and walked out into the April cold. The city moving around me without any particular awareness of what was moving with it. Somewhere 3 million copies were being loaded onto the presses. Julian Mercer was about to have the worst week of his professional life. He just didn't know it yet. 3 million copies. That was how many issues of Luminary's Architecture of Beauty special reached newsstands, landed in subscriber mailboxes and filled airport bookshop racks from New York to Los Angeles on the first Tuesday of May. I stopped at a newsstand on the corner of 68th in Lexington at 7:42 in the morning. I bought a copy. I stood on the sidewalk in the early May light and looked at it. The Aurora Beauty campaign ran across pages 44 through 47. 4 pages of studio photography shot by one of the industry's most respected photographers under conditions designed to produce images of immaculate luminosity. In the original submitted RAW files, that luminosity had served only to illuminate without intervention, without the skilled hand of a retoucher deciding what the client's narrative required. The camera had recorded everything with perfect democratic accuracy. The thin linear scar tracing the hairline behind the right ear. The textural inconsistency along the chin. The surgical pull at the outer corners of the eyes that no amount of directional lighting had managed to resolve. Genevieve looked exactly like herself. The self that existed beneath the version she had paid considerable sums to install. The lights had not been cruel. They had simply been lights on the facing pages. The feature opened. 2 photographs uncaptioned, no names beneath them. The first was a girl of about 19 photographed at what appeared to be a college event in institutional overhead light. The kind of light that makes no allowances for anyone. Her face was round at every angle. The cheeks carrying the heaviness of features not yet settled, the jaw soft and wide. Her skin told its own story without being asked. Acne had worked across the forehead and jaw in layered waves, leaving behind the uneven topography of someone who had fought that particular war for years. And not yet won it. Her nose was broad and flat, occupying the center of her face with an authority that drew the eye and gave nothing back. Her eyes sat pressed together, close set in a way that made her expressions look perpetually uncertain, like a face still negotiating its own geography. The second photograph showed a young man of perhaps 22, standing in what looked like a workshop or storage yard, squinting slightly into outdoor daylight. The jaw carried the natural softness of a face no surgeon had yet considered useful. His nose veered slightly leftward with the mild uncorrected asymmetry of cartilage that had grown as it pleased. The brow hung low and heavy over small eyes, the bone ridge unrefined, giving his face a quality of bluntness that photographs honestly and flatters no one. He looked in the clearest possible terms, like a man who had never once thought to look in a mirror and wonder what it might cost to become someone else. Readers could draw their own conclusions. At 9:47, my phone rang. Marcus Webb. Aurora Collective is down 18% at open. He said. Financial press is moving fast. By noon, Reuters had it at 31. 3 major retail partners had suspended contracts pending review. The associated market valuation loss in the fund's pre-IPO standing had crossed $300 million before the lunch hour ended. At 10:30, a cease and desist arrived from Genevieve's PR firm. My editor-in-chief called me into her office. Aura Beauty is claiming unauthorized proprietary file usage, she said. We used the original files their team submitted in June of last year. I said. They failed to deliver final approved files within the contractual 72-hour print window. Our production log timestamps every step. She reviewed the system log on her screen for 2 minutes. Then she looked up. Legal will handle the letter. You followed protocol. She paused. I also want to say this. You disclosed your relationship with this account before you opened a single file. That's the only reason we're standing in this office talking to each other as equals. At 2 o'clock, Page's message. Julian Mercer removed from his executive role at Aurora Beauty by board decision. The marketing director position he'd assumed in the months following Aurora Collective's second institutional round. Just confirmed. At 3:30, the Whitmore family released a statement indicating that Genevieve's formal association with the Grand Hotel Group was currently under review. At 5:00, Julian called. I picked up. Was this the plan from the beginning? His voice had a quality I had heard only once before the voicemail I had deleted in December. Something scraped down to its base material. No. I said the plan was to save $450,000 toward a house. You changed that plan. You destroyed everything. I used files your team submitted. I followed our editorial policy. I disclosed my relationship with you before touching a single file. Every step I took is documented. I waited one beat. In this industry, I can make anyone look like royalty with the right filter. But my actual job, the job I have done for 15 years, is not making things beautiful. It's deciding what deserves to stay in the frame. Today, the frame is finally clean. I ended the call. I left Luminary at 6. The city was settling into the particular rose gold of a May evening. The light low and generous in the way it only is for a few weeks each spring before summer hardens everything. I walked home. No cab. No urgency. Just the sidewalk and the city doing what it does. At some point, without thinking, my hand came up to the side of my neck. The scar. Small, pale. Fully healed. I didn't adjust my collar. I didn't smooth anything over. I just touched it. The way you touch something that has been part of you long enough to stop being a wound and become simply a fact. That night, my phone was quiet for the first time in more than a year. I sat by the window of an apartment that was entirely unconditionally mine and thought, what does a person do with all this open space? 6 months after the magazine hit the newsstands, autumn came back to New York. And with it a particular stillness that follows storms you never thought you'd survive. I took the subway to Brooklyn on a Saturday afternoon in November. Paige had her first gallery show, a small space near Prospect Park run by a collective of working artists. The kind of venue where the walls are painted white by whoever shows up willing to paint them and the wine at the opening is brought in by the bag. She found me near the entrance when I arrived. We had coffee instead of wine and walked the room together slowly. She told me what she knew. Julian was doing freelance marketing consulting somewhere in the suburbs. No title. No executive address in a glossy tower. He and Genevieve were still technically married, but they hadn't been photographed together since the spring. The baby had been given a name. Eleonora. She was being raised primarily by a woman named Maria, who by all accounts was doing a thorough and devoted job of it. I said quietly, Eleonora is a beautiful name. And I didn't say anything else. Genevieve hadn't appeared in public since May. There were rumors unconfirmed of a clinic in Switzerland. Paige mentioned it without elaborating. And I didn't ask her to. The week before, my editor-in-chief had called me into her office and offered me the deputy editor-in-chief position at Luminary. 9 years of work. The timing was a coincidence, she said. And I believed her. I had been building toward it long before any of this had happened. But I allowed myself a private smile on the walk home afterward at the particular shape of a year that could hold that much. We circled back to the paintings. Page's series was called UN Retouched. Small canvases, warm underpainting visible at the edges. Portraits of faces rendered without negotiation. Every crease kept, every uneven tone preserved. Every mark the body had made on itself over time. Held in place by someone who had decided those marks were worth the trouble of looking at directly. The subjects were anonymous. That was the point. I stopped in front of one near the back wall. A woman's face, 3/4 view. The light falling from the left. The skin was neither young nor old, simply present along the left side of her neck, small, precisely placed. No larger than a thumbnail. A scar. Page had painted it in the most concentrated luminous yellow in the entire canvas, while the rest of the portrait moved through cream and ochre and sienna. That mark was rendered in the color of morning light, of something found rather than lost. Flaws are where the light finds its way in, Page said from somewhere behind my left shoulder. I didn't negotiate. I bought it before she finished the sentence. I walked back through Prospect Park in the late afternoon, the painting tucked under my arm, the path covered in a drift of November leaves that had given up their color and come to rest without any apparent regret. The light was low and gold and full of the particular generosity that October and November share for about 6 weeks before winter ends the conversation. I thought about what had been lost. 3 years of a life I had built around someone who had not been entirely real. A city of two that turned out to have been a city of one. Money. Time. A version of the future I had drafted and revised and finally let go of, the way you let go of a draft that simply won't resolve into what you'd hoped. I had done a great deal of that kind of editing in the last 2 years. I was getting better at knowing when a thing was finished. I thought about what I had found that I hadn't gone looking for. A lawyer who told the truth plainly and charged fairly for it. A financial advisor who believed in the usefulness of a well-positioned minority stake. A roommate from a dormitory floor 20 years ago who had painted a small canvas in Brooklyn and hung it on a white wall and waited for the right person to stop in front of it. I thought about who I had not expected to become. Steadier. Maybe more patient with the distance between the moment you make a decision and the moment it declares itself. More comfortable in rooms where I had not been invited. And more certain about which rooms were worth entering. The park opened onto the street. And the city resumed its evening pace. Indifferent and warm. And entirely itself. I didn't know what I had expected to feel. Free perhaps. Lighter. And I had both. But more than that. I felt particular. Precise. Like someone occupying exactly the right amount of space. Not too much. Not a fraction too little. My own space. Outside the park. November moved around me without asking anything. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the first clean page of something I hadn't yet decided to write. If this story taught me anything, it's that family betrayal doesn't arrive with warning. It builds quietly in missed calls. In a phone face down on the counter. In a joint account steadily emptied while you were learning to breathe again. I saw every sign and chose to look away. Don't be like me. Ask hard questions before silence becomes its own answer. I believe. And God's hand is most visible here. That buried truths always find the surface. Family betrayal reshapes you at the core. Family revenge, however precise, heals almost nothing underneath. My honest view. Family revenge is a chapter, not a destination. Family betrayal devastates, but it is also information about who someone was and who you still get to become. Family revenge ends. But what you build next doesn't have to build something true. If this story resonated, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Comment your thoughts below and subscribe if you'd like to stay for what comes next. A note. Some upcoming stories blend fiction with truth built for reflection. If that's not for you, step away freely. No judgment. Thank you sincerely for being here and staying until the very last word. Thanks for your time today. I'll see you again in the next story.